Dear friends, welcome back to our regular appointment with the Mail of Dentro la Storia, our mailbox dedicated to you who follow us and can write to us. I remind you that the email address is fbetuzzi@dentrolastoria.net, specifying in the subject of the email, the Mail of Dentro la Storia. I ask you to put this in the subject line to make it easier to find the emails, because I really receive a lot of different topics. This way, I can select them and proceed with your curiosities, your questions, your criticisms, and your suggestions. Before we begin, however, allow me to thank all the followers who attended the dinner in Turin on February 17th. It was a very pleasant evening where, more than eating, we did eat. It's not like we left the table hungry, but we talked a lot, covering topics of contemporary history. In the end, I'll tell you this for the benefit of those who weren't there. We were almost kicked out of the restaurant because it was closing time. So they kindly and politely urged us to pay the bill and leave. But if it hadn't been that way, we probably would have stayed another hour or two just chatting. So for this reason as well, I have a suggestion for you. Try to coordinate to get in touch with each other. Maybe if you already know each other, or if you want to start a poll based on topics or geographic areas. We've already covered Turin, but there are other places, maybe big cities where I could still be present in the coming months. So try to coordinate and suggest some areas, cities, dates, or months when we could meet. It would really be something nice to do. Now let's move on to your emails. So Franco writes to me, who is a very dear friend of ours, a loyal follower. He writes, I've always wondered if there is any connection between the birth of Silicon Valley and the famous Area 51. Officially, Silicon Valley was born in 1971, but the truth is that everything started back in the 1940s and 1950s with an agreement between Stanford University and the Pentagon during the Cold War, mainly to create new radars and spy devices. I don't intend to fall into the trap of the legend surrounding alleged unidentified flying object crashes, because the story is based on solid facts. But the fact that everything started right after the Roswell incident in '47 is a curious coincidence. In fact, electronic technology and the use of rare minerals and materials, which were both difficult to study and to apply, it put the United States in such a strong position of commercial advantage worldwide that it still maintains it today. So much so that California alone produces a gross domestic product twice that of Italy. So, dear Franco, there are 1,000 legends, as you said yourself, linked to the Roswell incident, to Area 51, but the reality is a bit less romanticized than one might think. Simply, starting from the 1940s with the need to conduct research in completely new fields, think about nuclear energy, they began to give the green light to research in other areas as well. Then think about what led to the creation of plastics, which have now become something ordinary for all of us, but a century ago no one could have ever imagined. The development of plastic was extremely rapid. And what about the development of digital technology? Should we talk about that? If we think back to 2002, the year Minority Report came out in theaters, that movie with Tom Cruise, pre-crime, do you remember it? It's the first movie where the touchscreen is imagined. The possibility of touching a screen with your fingers, dragging elements, enlarging them, exploring. That was in 2002. 6 years later, the first smartphone came out. It's not science fiction. It's not something alien that's applied to everyday technology. Simply put, in the last century, technological research received such a boost, initially for military purposes, that research itself became increasingly intense and increasingly rapid, increasingly determined, and clearly always with more funds available, because obviously you need money to do research. All this has led to a very rapid path of technological evolution. A clear example was actually mentioned by Professor Eco before he died. What did Professor Eco say? That classical notions are eternal, they are destined to last. Scientific notions, on the other hand, are subject to change, to constant updating. So what is taught today as certain and reliable could be completely reconsidered and changed in 5, 10, or 15 years. This is precisely due to continuous progress. The United States clearly had an advantage due to the heavy investments made during the World War II and in the years that followed, to always maintain that margin of safety over their opponents, whether it was the Axis or later the Soviet Union and its satellites. But it's not as if on the other side there wasn't the same process, or at least a similar process of technological advancement. Let's think about the Soviet Union. Few people know that the Soviet Union, even though they couldn't work with certain light metals like aluminum, especially because of the very high costs, they had found alternative solutions by creating ultra-resistant steel alloys that were light enough to actually compete with aluminum. It's human ingenuity. It's the ability to adapt to the context and to the resources available. Also based on the principle of competition. We must not forget that between the 1960s and the late 1970s, the great superpowers were engaged in the space race, specifically the race to the moon. This also had an impact on the technology we use every day, because it's easy to transfer something from military science applied to the military field into the civilian world. During World War II, plexiglass was introduced, which today is something common. In the civilian field, it's not just something applied in the military field. This shows how the desire to improve, to always get better, to create new opportunities, can lead humanity to evolve even in terms of technology. Because actually there is the possibility to have something more advanced, higher, better. Well, all of this can be seen every day, but let's move on to another email. Someone writes to me, "Good morning. I'm writing to you to propose, if possible, a topic that has sparked my interest. The events of Porzûs, where Pier Paolo Pasolini's brother lost his life in 1945, if I'm not mistaken. It would be interesting to know the context and what really happened. In this regard, I would be grateful if you could suggest some readings on the subject. Thank you in advance," and so on. So, the events of Porzûs, as we know, are part of that final concluding period of the Second World War. It was also a time of revenge, sometimes ideological revenge, sometimes personal, a settling of scores. I remember that last month someone asked me to also talk about the Togliatti amnesty, which, by the way, is a topic I have kept on my agenda. I just had to postpone it for some reasons related to our programming. Actually, the Togliatti amnesty was proposed precisely to draw a veil over everything that had happened. All the massacres, all the killings, all the excesses on both sides. It was an attempt at reconciliation. The events of Porzius are something extremely tragic, and they're not even the only tragic event. Because in what was an ideological war within the acts of revenge at the end of World War II, we really find everything. We even find the example of the Monfalcone workers. Monfalcone, for those who don't know it, is a city in the province of Gorizia, overlooking the Adriatic, famous for its shipbuilding industry. The shipyard workers asked to be able to live their socialist dream by migrating to Yugoslavia, and they went to work at the torpedo factory in Fiume. They came back after a few years, partly disillusioned, partly almost driven out by the Yugoslav authorities, because it wasn't just an ideological or ethnic issue, there was much more to it. All this is part of a very delicate background which also gave rise to and developed our republic, because it has never been completely all analyzed, producing over the years, over the decades, even monsters. Monsters not in the absolute sense, but in a figurative sense. Monsters in the sense of political and social positions, extremely polarized and destined for perpetual conflict. Porzius, the episode of the workers of Monfalcone, and much more, it makes us understand. Today, just as perhaps at the end of World War II, Italy has lacked a bit of self-criticism, the kind that was done elsewhere, even at the cost of bloody trials. But it was something that had to be done, necessary, and instead, for other reasons, not so much out of a sense of, let's all get along, if you'll allow me the Roman expression, but simply out of the desire to draw a veil over it, to turn the page. In a hurry, They avoided actually analyzing what had happened on both sides. Because in the end, as the ancients wrote, only the dead see the end of war. The innocent, most of the time, are among those dead. Anyway, thank you, Barbara, for the suggestion, and maybe in the future, we'll also talk about the events of Porzius. Instead, Marco Beniamino writes to me from Venice, who is one of your subscribers. Thank you. I wanted to get more information about the conference on May 15th about Italy in the 1980s. Take, for example, the abolition of the monarchy and the cascade of noble titles, then the obligation for all citizens to contribute to public life with their own work, their own effort, their own ingenuity. A different Italy was born, an Italy that placed above everything else the principle of equal rights and equal duties, which in some ways recovered the spirit of the Risorgimento, that of unity, of the will to come together, to stand united, to be a united and solid country. And in other ways, it completed that Risorgimento era, reaffirming the necessity of certain rights, starting with the right to thought, to speech, to expression, a right that had been denied during the fascist period. So the conference will be based on this, on the origins of the Republic-Monarchy referendum of June 2nd and 3rd, 1946. A referendum whose 80th anniversary falls this year, and that's exactly why we decided to propose it as an opportunity for discussion. It will be open to everyone, and I can guarantee that as far as the European life stages and Treviso are concerned, access will be free. In Vittorio Veneto, as mentioned, it will be at the Museum of the Battle on May 14th in Treviso. It will be on May 15th at the Santa Caterina Auditorium, a former deconsecrated church and museum center. There are also paid parking lots nearby. There is no charge for admission. It will be in the morning, so generally the start time will be around 9 a.m. But we will be more specific in the coming weeks, also through the newsletter that will be published at the beginning of April. So as they say, stay tuned, stay alert, because it will be a great opportunity. Among other things, in agreement with Istrit, the Institute for the History of the Italian Risorgimento, we are also organizing an initiative for schools, because it's right for the younger generations to know, understand, and delve deeper into the fundamental themes of our Italy, of our republic, so that they can truly understand how our republic was born, how it developed, from what foundations, from what principles, and then what path it has taken to form that civic consciousness that is necessary to be good citizens, which is necessary to be complete individuals. Within our Italy, but not only that, also think about Europe, about the world. You can't think of being citizens without truly knowing everything that is part of our background, that is part of who we are. So I urge you to actually keep following us, but also to take part in our events and maybe have your children take part as well. Because what during the Enlightenment was called an encyclopedia, from encyclos paideia in ancient Greek, meaning circular education. That is a principle that still needs to be reaffirmed today. It's a fundamental principle, an exceptional principle that gives us the opportunity to understand, to comprehend, and to be even more inspired. I'll conclude with one last email I received from Lorenzo. He writes, I'm 21 years old, and I'm a big history enthusiast. I wanted to ask if you have any reading recommendations about campaigns, or even simple battles faced by the Royal Army during the Second World War. Also, testimonies from those who personally experienced those scenarios. The achievements, even the defeats, and the results of our troops are topics that interest me a lot. Thank you for everything you do, because having finished high school some time ago and chosen a university path far from law, you are one of the few things that continue to stimulate my great passion for history. So, Lorenzo, first of all, thank you. And regarding your request, I could give you some advice. I can't bombard you with titles because clearly you have to study too. But the first advice concerns the books of the late Major Paolo Cacciadominioni, who wrote books about his experience in Africa. Major Paolo Cacciadominioni was in command of a battalion of sappers in Africa. Even before that, he took part in a desert raid in the 1930s with other figures who came from all over Europe. And when he returned to Africa, he personally experienced both the assault on Tobruk in 1942, as well as the whole epic of El Alamein, the first battle, the one in the summer of 42, and then the second battle, the one of the Italian-German defeat. Paolo Cacciadominioni left behind two very, very beautiful books in which he retraces all of this, in which he draws portraits of many people he knew, from simple soldiers to generals, from illustrious figures like Feccia di Cossato to those who are more unknown. Paolo Cacciadominioni then saves a final section for himself, because it was he, with his stubbornness and his iron will, who wanted to return after the war to those deserts to recover the memory and give a proper burial to those who had fought. Among those sands, among those arid plains, among the various hills that are also found in the desert, he was the one who did all this. And through his testimony, which is incredibly human, because he manages to define with his gaze, with his pen, what was truly experienced. In the tragic moments, as well as in the tragicomic ones, because there were some, I assure you. So through his privileged perspective, his pen, we can relive, at least in part, what that theater of war was. So, dear Lorenzo, I thank you again, and I point out the books by Paolo Cacciadominioni. You should be able to find them quite easily. If you can't find them reprinted, I believe there are still some available on the used book market. Back then, I bought the originals. I still have them in my library, scattered among the many books that fill my library and that periodically emerge from the shelves. I wish you a good path in your studies and good reading, a great pleasure of discovery through reading, because reading is also the pleasure of discovering. I'll see you all again next month with another appointment with the mailbox of Dentro la Storia. Don't forget, write to fbatuzzi.dentrolastoria.net, specifying Dentro la Storia mail in the subject. Have a good day, everyone.